This is the first of many events where we're bringing together those rich, diverse Indigenous folks and the common agenda which we have, and that is our inherent rights to self-determination, our rights to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, all 46 articles, our rights to freedom from colonialism so that our children, our youth, and our families can live a full, robust life of choice on behalf of their tribal identity and their identity as an Indigenous person living off the reserves in Canada. As you've heard, the purpose of this two-day symposium is to deepen the dialogue with urban Indigenous peoples and communities, First Nations, and governments about implementing the right to self-determination in the urban context. Two-day symposium about what our rights are in the urban context and how they're being eroded by the federal government's distinctions-based approach. If we can do nothing more than teach our young people what the struggle looks like today, what it looked like 30 years ago, 40 years ago with the 69 white paper, assimilating us into becoming Canadian citizens. That's our job, is to build a legacy of leaders, young leaders, so that they know and they can hold all political parties and all governments of whatever stripe accountable for their ongoing ethnocide. And I mean that seriously, ethnocide. The way the governments have treated us over the last several decades and the way they're treating us today by denying us our fundamental rights to self-determination, what is the option that they're providing for our people? I ask you that question seriously. When they take our 36 tribal nations on the West Coast and turn us into 204 Indian Act band councils, deriving power from the Indian Act, which was designed to destroy us. These are the challenges that we've come to know, and these are the challenges that our young people are going to inherit moving forward. The right to self-determination in Article 3 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples state, Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. By virtue of that right, they freely determine their political status. They freely pursue their economic, social, and cultural development. The operative words there are freely. The NorthWest Indigenous Council and many other organizations like NWIC across this country, our people choose to become members of these nonprofit societies with their own objectives, their own aims and objectives at the end, which ultimately is self-determination. I encourage everyone to understand Article 3 of the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It doesn't say in the 46 articles and under Article 3, it doesn't say band councils. It doesn't say First Nations. It doesn't say Métis, and it doesn't say Inuit. It says Indigenous peoples. That's us. Article 4 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, UNDRIP, is the right to autonomy. Indigenous peoples, in exercising their right to self-determination, have the right to autonomy or self-government in matters relating to their internal and local affairs, as well as ways and means for financing their autonomous functions. That's Article 4. That applies to each and every one of us as Indigenous peoples in the borders of Canada. We have those rights. UNDRIP, I need to remind you, is it's a baseline. It's at the bottom. It's our responsibility to implement those rights, advocate for those rights as a baseline moving up for the betterment of our peoples and our nations. Article 5 of the UNDRIP is full participation. Full participation in your rights. Indigenous peoples have the right to maintain and strengthen their distinct political, legal, economic, social, and cultural institutions, while retaining their right to participate fully, if they so choose, in the political, economic, social, and cultural life of the state. These are your rights. Canada adopted this, I don't even know when it was now, 2000, I don't even know. It doesn't matter really, because they excluded us. They excluded urban Indigenous peoples when they adopted NWIC. They failed to consult all Indigenous peoples. The City of Vancouver here, wanting to be the city of reconciliation, adopted UNDRIP versions of it without consulting urban Indigenous peoples. So why are all these governments doing this? How are they able to get away with adopting all this legislation, or making legislation and policy when they don't consult you? They don't recognize Article 3, 4, and 5. And this is the lived reality that we experience today. And it's up to us to unite our efforts all over Canada to organize for the full implementation, full accountability of the colonial apparatus to ensure that our Indigenous peoples' rights and titles are moving forward by us, with us. British Columbia passed Bill 41 a couple years ago, pandemic time. They developed what they call the BC Action Plan for UNDRIP, and it called for the establishment of a provincial urban Indigenous advisory table. The development of this table will be informed by urban Indigenous leaders. Just by show of hands, how many of you are on that table? How many? Someone go look in the bathroom, see if anyone's raised their hand. No one? There was no discussion about the federal fiduciary responsibility to all Indigenous peoples, status, non-status, Métis, and Inuit. There was no discussion about that. There was no discussion about the Daniels, Supreme Court of Canada, Daniels decision, which tells the state that they have the full responsibility for Indigenous peoples. There was no discussion about the increasing homeless population over the last 8 years. 45% of the homeless population in British Columbia are Indigenous peoples, 45%. There was no discussion there that the fact that in 2002, 33% of the children in care were Indigenous, 2002 in BC. And today, in 2023, it's 62%. There was no discussion about that ongoing theft of our children. There was no discussion there regarding the fact that the prison population, when Trudeau took government, went from 30% to 32% as of about 4 months ago, where they reported. So more of our people are going to the prisons. More of our people are ending up in the streets. More of our people are being apprehended by the state to continue the neo-residential school policies. There was no mention about the increasing number of murdered, missing men, boys, women, girls, two-spirited peoples. Reconciliation isn't supposed to hurt our people. It should hurt the systems, because those systems should be changing for our people. But reconciliation is hurting our people, and there is no level of accountability, federally, provincially, or civically, by any political party in government. Even the opposition parties don't talk about the 80% of us living off the reservations. These are your rights, your responsibility. Most importantly, they're your children or your grandchildren that are feeding that industry. But these are the truths of contemporary Canadian colonialism in action. And that's why when Brock said we wanted to host this event in the downtown east side, we wanted you to come through the downtown east side. We wanted you to see our brothers and sisters, our youth, and yes, some of our children and our women that are victims of modern day urban colonialism. Because it's there for you to see if your eyes are open, your heart is open. And it's up to us to unite and work and challenge this colonialism. No treaty exists between Canada and the Coast Salish peoples. None, zero. Despite the rapid growth of the urban Indigenous communities in BC and the pressing need for new forms of political representation and governance, government is narrowing down who they can talk to. We know what that looks like because they've always done that. They try to make it as narrow as possible. And they don't want to touch us because once they start talking to us, they have to start recognizing rights and responsibility and transfer of resources and building our own governments. We know that. It's as old as Canadian colonialism. There are 25 different forms of self-government agreements have been negotiated between Canada and 43 Indigenous communities today. 25. Currently, there are 50 self-government negotiation tables dealing with the structure of a new Indigenous government and its relationship with other governments. What does that look like when you look at federal, provincial, civic, and Indigenous authority and resourcing? What does that look like? What are those new funding agreements? The relationship between those jurisdictions, ways to promote for programs and services, how they will be delivered. The whole model of colonial service delivery is built upon divide and conquer, competition. You are my competitor. I can't talk to you, I can't work with you because you might bid on that same contract that I want that sustains my position. That whole ethos of their request for proposal process is based on compartmentalization and division and not working in unity at every level and funding at every level. Ways to promote community and well-being through Indigenous languages, heritage, and culture, and socio-economic initiatives, and preparation for when an agreement takes place. These are the serious things that we need to be talking about systematically, structurally. Systematically, structurally. Not this group over there, or that group over there, or that group over there. It's like, how do we bring them all together? How do we support our children, our youth, our families, our elders in every neighborhood? Not a program, not a service, but a right, a fundamental human right that's covered in UNDRIP. Our urban Indigenous communities are significantly different, and I don't have to tell you this, than the on-reserve First Nations. We are so much different. You know it's a swear word out there now when you go to the national level? Pan-Indianism. That's become a swear word, believe it or not. I even heard, I go to the AFN gatherings and they're going, oh, we don't want nothing to do with that Pan-Indianism stuff. We only deal with the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. All funding has to be those three streams, not Pan-Indianism. Yet, when you come to Vancouver or Winnipeg or Toronto, or you have Pan-Indians all over the place. The new communities, the new realities, economy of scales, the infrastructure we currently have in place with our housing societies, our friendship centers, our service delivery, that is our reality. So if you're excluding pan-Indianism, you become complicit in my ethnocide. Another word that is getting lost. It wasn't lost when I first got involved in this 35 years ago. Mobility rights. Because if you understand anything about Canadian colonialism, it's about limiting your rights to a very few who live in a very small reservation that was designed to keep us there until we died off. The feds, the province, the cities, they don't want to recognize our mobility rights, our portability rights. Yet our ancestors lived in that environment. We had trading routes all along the coast and through the Chinook trails. Our people, regardless of where you came from, you had rights where you went, wherever you went. But part of those rights also meant you have responsibility to understand the law, understand the peoples of whom territory you're on. Mobility rights. Just say that when you go to government meetings and say, yeah, we're talking about mobility rights, and they'll just get all, well, they'll get pissed at you. But anyway, it doesn't matter. What they're doing to our people is unforgivable. Mobility rights. We are Indigenous wherever we go in the world. If you're a Haida wherever you are. You're Tsimshian, you're Cree, Algonquin, Mi'kmaq, it doesn't matter. Canadians enjoy mobility rights, but when it comes to us as Indigenous peoples, we're only Indian when we're on the res. So these are the 5 lingering questions. You're going to get this, and I sure hope you share these 5 questions with everybody. Think systematically, structurally. The 5 questions. 1, what process or mechanism currently exists or should be created for the next steps towards self-government for urban Indigenous peoples? That's a good question. Question 2, what should be the respective roles of the federal, provincial, and the municipal jurisdictions? They're all living on stolen land. Everything that they have is based on the benefits of unceded territories or stolen lands. What are the pragmatic approaches to dealing with the diversity of urban Indigenous peoples in the urban environment? Remember, I just talked a little bit about pan-Indianism. Right? How is Winnipeg dealing with it? How is Vancouver dealing with it? How is Victoria dealing with it? So forth. That's the stuff we're going to pull out. In addition to that, all the good research over the years that's already addressed these issues. Number 4, who should be negotiating on behalf of urban Indigenous peoples? Who? You think about that one. Because I know what the government's been doing the last X number of years, say 12, 14 years. I know what they've been doing. They cherry pick their Indians or organizations, and that way they say, oh, we've addressed reconciliation with the urban environment. That's what they do. And the media lets them get away with it. Just another challenge, part of the struggle. And question number 5 is, how will financing of urban Indigenous governments be managed? How will we ensure that there's accountability and transparency, that decisions are evidence-based, that they're actually going to help our children, our youth, our families? 1996, the report on the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, RCAP, provided specific attention to the subject of Indigenous self-government in urban settings. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal People, 1996, at that time the most expensive Royal Commission in Canadian colonial history. 440 plus recommendations, 1996. Can you guess how many of them they've implemented on behalf of the off-reserve population? Yeah, pretty well 0. Created a lot of jobs, though, for a short time. So how do we move forward? How do we move forward instead of repeating that that hamster, that hamster on that wheel just spinning around while the governments continue, because they don't want to give up their authority or their resources. So a formal process of recognition needs to be required by all levels of government. A formal process of recognition of our rights needs to be recognized. Standards for recognizing nationhood must be flexible. Nationhood. What is a nation? What does it look like? I go home and I get in fights with my cousins. I go, my band council is not a nation. They're a band council. They got their authority from the Indian Act. Because they're not nations. Band councils come from the Indian Act. The Indian Act was built in 1876 to destroy our nations. The Haida, the Tlingit, the Tsimshian, Coasalish, Algonquins, Mi'kmaq. Those are nations that are deliberately being broken up. 63 of them broken up into 635 Indian Act band councils that I'm supposed to hold up and say it's a nation. When I know what the Indian Act has done to me personally, is doing to me personally, doing to my children, and every one of you. I want to touch on that one just a little bit because it's a very hot topic today, this pretend Indian stuff. Now we're all pointing fingers at each other. You're not as much Indian as all that crap. Well, we're all doing that. Our rights are being eroded over here. 100%. Don't play that game. Each tribal nation has its own laws for identifying who their citizens are. I didn't say band councils, I said tribal nations. They all have adoption, they all have marriage, they all have this. We need to revive that law. A new federal machinery of government is required to avoid the Indian Act regime. We have to create our own stories, our own narratives that benefits our people here today and for future generations. Those are not empty words. Models of representation are being overshadowed by policies concerning service delivery. The whole shebang in the bubble of Ottawa is we're going to recognize these Indians. We're going to redeem our way of 150 years of colonialism. We have to change the narrative. It's up to us. We have to hold up our traditional nations, our traditional leadership, what you call the hereditary chiefs. Almost every nation in Canada is matrilineal, matriarchal, matrilocal. The women are the bosses. The men, if you want to marry one of them, you got to go live in their village. And you better not piss them off because they'll banish you. So they bring an Indian Act in, which is patrilineal, patriarchal, patrilocal. You're destroying nations. So I don't uphold Indian Act. So they're talking about service delivery over here. Meanwhile, they're violating our sovereign title and rights that are protected by their own Supreme Court of Canada decisions that they never honor. We have to change the narrative. The federal government has negotiated 120 urban reserves across Canada, but has not concluded any self-government agreement with urban Indigenous communities. The expansion of the Indian Act regime into urban areas is not an answer to urban Indigenous self-government. Do not be fooled. How many of you want to become part of an Indian Act self-government arrangement in the city? Can anyone put their hand up? Anyone? That's what they're doing. That's what they're doing. Termination agreements. Extinguish your nations, extinguish your mobility rights, extinguish your rights to be free from colonialism, and your children and your grandchildren. The distinctions-based approach of the federal and BC governments has undermined the urban Indigenous struggle for self-determination. I go all over the province doing these events, and I ask the audience, I say, how many of you have heard of distinctions-based approach? Many times, I'm not saying once or twice, I'm saying like 20 times. Distinctions-based approach. I honestly, maybe one or two people have put their hand up. All this stuff is being done by stealth. keep us down. And while they got us down being victims, while they got us down just trying to get food on our table for our kids, all this stuff is happening. And we can see it if you open your eyes. The feds can see it too, by the way. We're starting to wake up. We're no closer to urban Indigenous self-government than we were in 1996, the Royal Commission on Aboriginal People. I had Damon here in 1996 talking about urban Indigenous self-government from Winnipeg. We're no closer. Remember that hamster wheel? We keep doing it. We need to change that narrative. New thinking will be required, and this symposium is providing us an opportunity to refashion the dialogue and introduce some different and contrasting viewpoints into the discussion about urban Indigenous self-government. That's why we're here, folks. We want to hear what's going on elsewhere. We want you to be bold. I remember that conference we had back in, I think it was 96. Damon, you said, you get out there and you put that stick in the ground. That's self-determination, and then you work around that. That's what we have to do. We don't wait for our colonizer to be nice to us. All right? We don't wait. We just do it. Self-government, self-determination begins with us. And we have to change that narrative. So, Haichka OCM.